Oh, dude, that's perfect. Try to find you a pointer. What part don't work? I think I'm probably okay with that one. I can use the.
What?
Where's the big stick?
Oh, you want to use that the huge stick?
I can do the mouse. The mouse gets tricky though, right?
Yeah. Why none of these are working? Like disappear really quickly. It's because I'm on service right now.
Oh, okay. How are things going with interviews and application and everything?
Interview, I mean, I think. FYI, we're being recorded.
Okay, currently. No,
Yeah,
at
yeah.
some point.
No, right now.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
But they're good. I just don't know. I gotta talk to Lang about which this
Okay.
but this he's on for this.
That's fine. I can use the screen. Is it, so it must be just the interface with the
It has to
computer.
be.
Yeah.
Well, last time when we've done it, I put it in here and it
It's
usually
just
works.
read it? Okay.
Yeah, and so this time it is not so much.
That's okay. I'll do it. I'll be right here. It's fine. And that allows, actually, the people online just watch the audience.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then
yeah.
They see the PowerPoint, so that doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Okay.
Your PowerPoint's being shared right now with them.
Okay, great. And you're doing PowerPoint Live or something?
Yeah. So. There you go.
Hey,
Morning.
how's it going, Jeremy?
Good, how are you?
Good. Oh, wait, hey, here we go. It works, it works.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay. Where's your white coat? You can't be in there without a white coat.
What's going on here? I know it's my white coat. Was I gonna be the only one wearing white coat? You guys were the last one.
Crowds, but Mike always makes it.
I know. That's good.
And then,
Yeah. That's certainly fine.
is it gonna bother you if I get a over me slathering?
Well, it's time to do. How's it going?
Good. Yeah, I just, dropped off at school.
Oh. She's just in Arkansas. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the right time.
Yeah.
How old is Zoe? What grade?
9.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. She's friends with,
Plan.
I saw the last one. Sam's pick up. I'm just getting big.
Oh, yeah, I heard that there was fish, so it's like. My uncle's here with the fish.
Yeah.
Not to
Yeah.
get into that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cute. When it can handle like, like man, the woman, the booth.
Yeah.
And people come up and you go up to the back gate.
Yeah, yeah.
$200 cash.
Nice.
And, it was fun. Yeah, Benji, the 8th grader, so he probably, it's your daughter. Older, wiser.
Yeah.
Knowledgeable.
Yeah.
Apparently, Blaine sits next to Benji or near Benji in things. There's a bunch of like combo.
Yeah. Yeah, let's think about it, do it, what's yours?
Mr. Scott. Oh, it's in the, yeah, Elena and Benji and Mr. Scott are based.
Okay.
They love him. Yeah, Benji loves him. He's kind of smart. Sarcastic.
Yeah.
He's. Trust me, it's.
This, it's good to, it's
Jaded,
the skin fix shows in the sense. So I got, Carl with our Scully, he stopped on this paper came out. So, yeah, congratulations, and then he sent me some. Some. I'll just do that. So, it's DVD covered now.
Going fine with these. Good.
Yes.
The climate has changed. A little cooler.
Uh-huh.
Nice breathing.
Oh, no, it's a comment, I'm stupid, that's one of the.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So like it's funny because it'll like, it's the there's two articles in it, right? There's the larger one, which like all of you guys, and there's the B one. So there's been a lot of press and like CNN, NPR, and there's like been a bunch out, and it's like, Bill Feldman from UCLA talks like this. Yeah, there's another study.
Yeah.
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 It doesn't.
Yeah.
There's another study. Yeah. Yeah, he talks about this and stuff like that. So yeah, nobody's reached out to me. I'll say that.
So it's not the officers thing, and then it reminded me of, years ago, I had a paper come out, a business paper, and someone sent me, like this is being covered in the press again, and it was like, it's being covered in the Mumbai Mirror. Mumbai.
And this is before ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Auto generating these sorts.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh, well, I guess there's no such thing as bad press, right?
Wow, this is a new setup.
Sorry, did they change up did this mic issue get addressed? I sent emails and
I see a new device.
Okay, is that a good thing? That thing is new?
That's new.
Is it don't touch anything. I muted
Yeah, don't touch
the
anything.
sound
Uh-huh.
because there's the feedback. So like, FY you're being muted or you're being recorded. So
Oh,
yeah, so I don't know how to fix that. I don't know if the mic is gonna work or not for Weppner. He might have to
so normally,
do the whole Carly thing.
What is that? Project?
Yeah.
I can't do either. Can I mumble and speak fast?
normally they're. What is this?
That's the microphone, so the headset. I don't know.
Normally mine is plugged directly into the computer. Where's that cable? Is that this one here? Let's see.
Jamie, one of the reasons
Let's try this.
analyze the next
Curious.
round of analysis.
Right.
Get started.
Check.
So this muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Chief with magic.
Chief Magic. You got sound now? Online? Checking sound online, checking sound online.
Yes, works.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Oh, I hear feedback now. Check one, check two. Okay,
I don't know why that area, but it works now.
that's weird.
It's fine. It's like the exact same thing. It's quietly like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, you're good. Yeah.
I know. It's not really. No, the new car from the original.
Okay, like start, you are right. Eric, you get it.
Oh, yeah.
So Dr. William Weppner is an internal medicine physician and a clinical educator here at the VA, Boise, Idaho. Received his MD and MPH at the University of Washington. Completed his primary care internal medicine training at UW Boise/Seattle residency program. And then did a subsequent general internal medicine fellowship in health services and health policy. He's currently associate professor of medicine in Boise section head for the division of general internal medicine for the UW School of Medicine. Give up to Dr. Weppner.
And thanks, everybody, for being here today. Very happy to talk on this subject, and the timing's actually pretty good. We just had a paper that came out in JAMA a couple weeks ago that aligns with this, so I'm going to weave that into the discussion. For those of you that don't know me or haven't heard talks on this before, besides the clinical role and educational role that I have at the VA, I do research in health services and have been focusing on pulmonary care, COPD, improving the care of patients after their discharge from hospital. And many of you might have received emails about patients that have COPD, obstructive sleep apnea. We're trying to recruit into a current study to extend telepulmonary rehab and weight loss services to them. So if you have received emails or referred patients, thank you very much. If you have patients you might want to refer, please let me know. But this talk today is an opportunity for me to talk about things that I'm interested in related to the climate sphere and related to COPD and respiratory disease, and also to help me and some of my collaborators think about next steps in research with some of the data that we have in order to try to improve care for patients with COPD and asthma that we're taking care of here at the VA. So the title of the talk today is Climate Change, Respiratory Diseases, and You, because a lot of this comes back to us as clinicians, you as clinicians and providers, how we provide care, the choices that we make, and how we counsel our patients in this regard. So we'll go ahead and begin. In terms of disclosures, I have no financial disclosures to provide today. I will talk about one off-label medication use, which is kind of dumb that it's still off-label because it's Symbicort for asthma. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but technically it's off-label, so I'll look that up. I'm an employee of the VA. This is not necessarily the position of the VA. I'm not an official representative in that capacity. And I have an academic appointment with the University of Washington, and this is not necessarily their opinion either. I do work with two local organizations that are interested in the climate and health sphere. Well, one's local, one's national. Idaho Clinicians for Climate and Health and the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. I don't receive any money or time from them. As per usual, it is the opposite. So in terms of things that we're going to cover today, these are the learning objectives. And in 4 parts, I wanted to take time to review evolving and accumulating evidence on the environmental impacts on respiratory health of climate change, particularly on vulnerable populations, the very old, the very young, folks that have been subject to more exposure for environmental hazards. I'd also like to take time to review recent guidelines for treatment of common respiratory conditions. So COPD and asthma. We deal with a lot of COPD in our patient population. We deal with a little bit of asthma. These are the two most common respiratory chronic conditions in the world. So we see a lot of this. I'd like to take time to discuss the irony in which the medications that we provide to treat these diseases actually contribute to them occurring. I usually say in the future, but I'd say in the now. And then through all of this, discuss a path forward, balancing appropriate treatment with environmentally friendly practices. Thank you. So beginning with a review of evidence. So one of the important premises of this talk is the idea that climate change, air pollution, and health are all interrelated in the nexus. Air pollution and climate change have a very obvious common source, and that is the burning of fossil fuels for energy, transportation, the other reasons that we burn fossil fuels for. Those are the two largest contributors now. When you use fossil fuels for energy and transportation, primarily, you generate a lot of air pollutants that are listed here. You also generate a lot of greenhouse gases, which thereby contribute to further climate change and further pollutants being put into the atmosphere. There is a fair bit of greenhouse gas emissions from other activities such as agriculture or where we live, how we cook, how we heat. These are all human generated, and we'll call out a smaller segment that is not human generated, which is from wildfires and natural sources like volcanoes, although one might argue that wildfires are increasing as a result of climate change. So that there's a further contribution there. The different pathways, the respiratory pathways in which climate change can affect health are listed here. I pulled these from the EPA website. They're still available there, so that's nice. But a couple of obvious ones would be increased particulate matter, which we inhale into our lungs, depending on the size and depending on the effects, has adverse effects. There are increased indoor pollutants, and the example that's given here is after flooding or increased humidity, there might be more mold or bacteria that are growing in people's residences, their houses, which can further worsen respiratory conditions. Increased wildfires over the past few decades, particularly in the West, we've seen increase in the intensity, the frequency, and the duration of the wildfire season. So we see that a lot. We actually had a good smoke season this year. I don't know what that means about next year, but in general, year over year, those numbers are increasing. Another thing that I'll talk about in general related to climate change is the increased pollen counts that we see. I oftentimes put this in the annoyance category because I have seasonal allergies. I'm like, wow, that's really annoying that they're worse and longer. When you think about asthma and respiratory diseases, this is a trigger that's more severe for exacerbations, which of course can be life-threatening. So thinking about it in that context, I think, is important. Finally, increased ozone. And again, this isn't the good ozone up in the troposphere that protects us from skin cancer and lets our plants grow a little bit better. This is the bad ozone that happens when heat on concrete and near volatile organic compounds comes up, and these free radical ozones get into our circulation or into our lungs and cause short-term and long-term damage. So those are all the respiratory pathways that one might link climate change to illness in the lungs. This evidence is also manifesting in epidemiological studies of mortality. So these are two studies from the past year. One, the wildfire study just came out last month, where taking individual epidemiological studies for wildfire events or looking at geographic information systems to understand expected versus observed amounts of diseases. Scientists and researchers have given us predictions or estimates of how climate change and things contributing to climate change are also increasing premature deaths. The first study is looks at air pollution related to oil and gas the oil and gas industry, and this is both everything from extraction to processing to end use. And based off of their analysis of the impacts, it's an estimated 90,000 additional deaths per year in the United States as a result of that extracting oil and gas. And it is disproportionately impacting folks that are extracting it, people that live near the highways where it is used, people that live in Louisiana and Texas, where it is refined. Those tend to be more frequently people of color, marginalized communities, people with lower socioeconomic status. So those that are less able to deal with the health consequences of that exposure. Wildfire smoke, this study came out and they estimate that 41,000 additional deaths are happening each year because of wildfire smoke. Pause there for a second and say, wait a second, Bill, that's about how many people die from car accidents per year. It's a pretty significant number when you think about it. And the other part of this, and as is usually the case, it is expected to increase over the next few years. All of this data is summed up into even larger analyses, such as this one, the state of global air from last year, 2024. And this is a collaboration between the Health Evaluation Institute, which is in Boston, and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is in Seattle, where they take all this data, they put it in a big old data crunching machine, and they come out with estimates called the global burden of disease. And this is specifically functionally the global burden of disease related to air pollution. They estimate that in the most recent year of available data, air pollution caused over 8 million deaths worldwide, and now has become the second leading cause of death behind hypertension globally. It is also applicable to children under 5 years. So even toddler age kids are getting exposed to air pollution in a way that meaningfully impacts their lives. The way that it manifests is in the diseases listed at the top. It's attributable to half of the cause of COPD. Pause on that for a second. A quarter of the cause for ischemic heart disease and stroke, and then a substantial amount of lung cancer and type 2 diabetes. Most of it's from ambient PM 2.5. That's particulate matter 2.5, the smallest 2.5 micron stuff that lodges way down in your lungs and really irritates it. But there's also deaths from indoor air pollution and ozone, which can have direct pulmonary effects. This is an explanation of how COPD happens. And I got this from the GOLD criteria. I think we all kind of know the GOLD criteria. Hopefully we'll talk about it more. When I was in medical school, I think I was taught COPD happens because you smoke. Some people who smoke don't get COPD. Some people that get COPD didn't smoke. That's all we know about it. I mean, at least that was my rudimentary understanding of it. This takes a deeper dive into it and tries to explain it in a model that goes from, they call it genetic, environmental, and time-based omics, getomics. I think there's a lot of omics in this model, but the general idea is that your genetics and environmental exposure accumulated over time lead to certain epigenetic and immune responses and kind of development and then repair processes that can, in some people, lead to development of COPD, and other people, they repair it and they move on and they don't have as much of a decline. But central to this is the fact that these exposures drive these disease states, which makes a fair bit of sense. In terms of climate change and asthma, this is also data that was cited and supported by the EPA over the past several years. I think it's been long held that exposure to particulate matter 2.5 has been associated with development of asthma in kids, and that's pretty classic air pollution exposure. But there's more recent evidence that larger air pollution, the particulate matter 10 or 10 micron particles that aren't supposed to get as deeply into your lung and are more associated with traffic-related air pollution, are associated with developing asthma in kids, and for those kids, them needing to go to the emergency room or hospital for treatment. Another study which parallels the COPD model that I just talked about suggests that air pollution carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and PM 2.5 can actually suppress genes that regulate the body's ability, young children's ability to differentiate harmful allergens, such as viruses, bacteria, from ones that might be, that are not as harmful and that can predispose them to asthma and cause asthma. Other contributors would be ozone exposure, mold, like we talked about, more pollen as a trigger for asthma flares, and something called thunderstorm asthma. Has anybody heard about this? Johnson on his head. So thunderstorm asthma is kind of a fascinating and unfortunate circumstance in which thunderstorms, due to probably a lot of factors that maybe they don't understand, I definitely don't understand, but changes in temperature and then electrical activity takes the pollens, which are big enough, they normally come out of the lungs, and it breaks them into smaller pieces that become even more hyperallergenic to young lungs that might have asthma. And so there'll be these flares of ER admissions for asthma after large thunderstorms. And the fact that thunderstorms are becoming more frequent suggests that we'll be seeing more of these. I thought that was kind of a small but fascinating thing. All right. In terms of EPA's response to this, so a lot of the data that we were talking about was from EPA, supported by EPA, promoted by EPA. With the recent change of the administration, the EPA is now pivoting 180 degrees to say, never mind, greenhouse gases aren't harmful to human health. And they've opened a comment period, sorry, they open and close a comment period on the what's called the endangerment finding. So probably y'all have heard about this a little bit in the news, it's been in the headlines. But 15 or 16 years ago, the EPA said, you know what, based off of this mountain of evidence that we have, suggesting that these certain greenhouse gases have adverse human health effects, we're going to roll it under the Clean Air Act and regulate it along with other pollutants. The endangerment finding being rescinded means they will not pay attention to this and undercuts a lot of the ability for the Clean Air Act to address these important causes of climate change. During the comment period, there's a lot of opposition letters that were written, including by the American Thoracic Society, Medical Society Consortium for Climate and Health, the pediatricians, internal medicine docs, AMA, et cetera, along with thousands of other scientists. That said, I don't think it's going to change the rescission of the endangerment finding that will happen. So we'll see what occurs as a result of that. All right, we'll switch gears and go to guidelines for treatment of common respiratory conditions. So, and this is mainly on COPD and asthma. So just to give you a sense of how common it is, COPD is estimated to be around 10% of the global population, and that's expected to rise over the next couple decades. Asthma is a smaller but still substantial amount. With this worrisome statistic, when you think about the population that asthma occurs in, tending to be younger people and children, 1,000 people die daily as a result of asthma exacerbations. We do have a lot of options to treat this nowadays. So this is a screenshot of the American Lung Association's list of all the inhaled medication we can use to treat asthma and COPD. And it's confusing, right? You automatically look at this and say, gosh, there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of inhalers. Patients are usually confused. They come and they say, no. I was using the green one. That one didn't work. So I'm using the yellow one. You have to Google what the inhaler is and take a float up and look at it and figure out what the inhaler is. This is a way to do that if you're interested. But the point of this is there's a lot of different types of medications and a lot of different delivery devices. The delivery devices that we'll talk about today, if we categorize them, are typically these ones that look like they're a little angled. Those are meter dose inhalers that contain hydrofluoroalkanes, which is an environmentally harmful or contributor to greenhouse gas. We also have these medications that are soft mist inhalers. Not only do they have a great name, they are also gentler on the environment because they don't have that HFA type propellant that sticks around the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas for decades afterwards. And finally, we have the dry powder inhalers, which look like discs or little phaser type things. Those are literally crushing a pill or some type of powder device and inhaling that in. The older devices kind of sucked. They were really weird. You had to put little pills in a thing and crush it and move it. Nowadays, they're a lot more effective in terms of being able to deliver medications. And they have a much lower carbon footprint because they have no propellants whatsoever. It's just up to you to inhale the powder into your lungs. Okay. All right. So I'll pause and say, whenever I say llama lava, I think of llama llama. Does everybody know llama llama? Does anybody know the ludicrous version of llama llama? Okay, look up if you haven't looked up the ludicrous version of llama llama where he reads llama llama, red pajama, that might be the best thing you get from my talk today. But okay, I'll put it out there. Who's the best? And I'm going to say ludicrous. Okay, yeah, we'll compare llama llama. Okay, so every time you say llama lava, you think about llama llama red pajamas. You can also think about the type of delivery devices that are used together, because there are a lot of options, particularly in the llama lava class that we'll talk about. I realize this is some alphabet soup, and I'm sorry that once again at the VA, there's even more acronyms than you thought was even possible. But I've listed them here. I think most of us know SABA is albuterol. SAMA tends to be ipratropium. LABA, long-acting beta agonist, for us tends to be formoterol, salmeterol. There's other options too. LAMA is a long-acting muscarinic antagonist, tiotropium, and ICS is inhaled corticosteroid. There's some other acronyms. I'll try to weave those in as we discuss them, but being able to anchor in those as we're talking about treatment options is particularly important. Okay, I alluded to this before, but the meter dose inhalers are a healthcare superpollutant, and that's because they contain hydrofluorocarbons. These are short-lived but very high global warming potential pollutants that are found in refrigerants, aerosols, and yes, meter dose inhalers. Most of them are HFAs, the version that we see as HFA 154, HFA 227. And these all replaced chlorofluorocarbons, which were even worse, 10 times worse, and burn a hole in the ozone. Those were replaced in 2013. In the United Kingdom, in England, it's estimated that meter dose inhalers constitute 3 to 4% of the carbon footprint of their entire healthcare system. So you say that's kind of a small amount, but when you think about this one, delivery device and their entire healthcare system, it's a relatively large proportion. And until recently, broad estimates in the U.S. healthcare system have been lacking. With that in mind, we'll talk about GOLD guidelines for COPD. And I think most of us should be familiar with these because we take care of a lot of patients with COPD. So this is the old GOLD standard from 2020. It's a little hazy because it's already fading into the mists of time, which is good because we get to forget two of the categories, group C up top and group D, because they get merged into one category. The way to orient yourself, if you're not totally familiar with this chart, is the idea that on the y-axis here is the number of exacerbations a patient might have related to their COPD, or exacerbations worse when we use more intensive therapies. And then, of course, on the x-axis, there is symptoms as measured by the Modified Medical Research Council or the COPD assessment test. Basically, how is your cough? How short of breath are you? The more short of breath you are, the more intensive of a treatment you're going to get. But that's in the LAMA-LABA area without including inhaled corticosteroids. All right, so this is the updated version. It's a little bit cleaner, easier to see. And again, group D and C has been merged to group E. Do you know why they call it group E? Exacerbate. Great. Thank you, Megan. It's also the next letter in the alphabet, but I like the fact that they chose E because it is all about exacerbations. And the rest of the stuff has stayed the same. Apparently, there's a different way to spell bronchodilator in the UK. But a bronchodilator means any type of SAMA, SABA, LAMA, LABA, but does not include, of course, an inhaled corticosteroid. Take a little bit of time to talk about factors to consider when starting an inhaled corticosteroid. And even though over the past couple of decades, inhaled corticosteroids have been refined to be a little bit more focused on the lung, have less systemic effects, they still do. And there's also been evidence that has suggested that it reduces the risk of a repeat exacerbation, COPD exacerbation that puts you in the hospital, but it increases your risk of pneumonia and fractures. So when you're thinking about inhaled corticosteroid, besides having a history of exacerbations, you also want to think about, do they have a physiology which would be responsive to an anti-inflammatory steroid medication? The way that we have seen that in studies and now use them clinically is the number of eosinophils they have in their blood. So you scan back to see how many eos they've had with their CBC, because they've always had a CBC. And if it's greater than 300, that tends to be suggestive that they're going to be more responsive. If it's less than 100, it's less likely they're going to be responsible. If it's somewhere in between, which it often is, they might be, and then you'd anchor again in their number of exacerbations. There's other infectious considerations that you might have, but mainly it's exacerbations and eosinophil count. Okay. All right. Keep that in mind as we switch to asthma. We don't take care of as many patients with asthma, right? In our veteran population, it tends to be a childhood disease, so people don't make it into the military if they have asthma, but we still see it. We still see it as a exposure to things that they have, the veterans have seen during their service. This is a little bit more of a confusing set of guidelines. Who's familiar with the GINA guidelines? A little bit, sort of. The GINA guidelines are international guidelines. It's the global initiative, for asthma. And it's a nonprofit organization where you have to pay to get their slides. That's how they fund what the work they do. But as a result, they have more frequent updates, annual updates, and it's more timely in terms of how they're responding to the evidence and how they're making it applicable to global audiences. The U.S. has society recommendations. Those haven't been updated, at least as far as I'm aware, for the past 5 years. So they're a little bit behind. And so I'll focus on the GINA guidelines, which is what we use. And the GINA guidelines are based on this idea that up at the top, that cycle, you're assessing a patient's situation, basically. You're making a recommendation for an inhaler based off of their level of symptoms, and then you're adjusting that over time and reviewing the effectiveness of that medication adjustment and side effects and how they evolve over time. You're constantly doing that. So you might move up and down the different steps, although we tend to kind of ratchet up and stick, because that's how the natural history happens in a lot of people. There's 2 tracks. That's also confusing. So the top track is the one that I think if GINA had their way, they say, this is what it is. Everybody's going to do this. We don't care about track 2. And the reason is track 1 is based off of one inhaler. It's one inhaled corticosteroid with one fast-acting, this is key, fast-acting bronchodilator. So it could be fast-acting formoterol. It could be fast-acting albuterol. But salmeterol isn't fast-acting enough. We don't like that one. So there's only certain beta agonists that they think is fast-acting enough. So in this model, you would use something like Symbicort, which is budesonide formoterol as a meter dose inhaler. And you could also use Dulera, but Symbicort's a little bit more popular. And you give that to the patient. You say, for a step 1 or 2, they use it only as an anti-inflammatory reliever. This used to be called a rescue inhaler. But if you have symptoms, you use the inhaler. If you don't have symptoms, you don't have to use the inhaler. But when you use an inhaler, you're getting some inhaled corticosteroids plus the beta agonist, which gives you the rapid action, and it calms down the inflammation. We'll go into the evidence a little bit more, but it's much more effective than albuterol alone. For step 3, step 4, as you move up, you might have them take it on a daily basis. So step 3, here's 1 or 2 puffs a day of the Symbicort, but you can go up to 12 based off of our asthma action plan that we come up with. Step 4, okay, you're at higher levels, 2 puffs twice a day, etc. Track 2, it's just you do that in 2 separate inhalers. So here's your albuterol. If you use the albuterol, man, you got to use this one too. Don't forget that one. It's right over there. Don't forget it. When you forgot it, darn shoot, you ended up in the emergency room. Dang. So, but that's still the general idea is to use them together. It's just not in a combo. And there's some nuanced differences in there, but the same principles of using an anti-inflammatory reliever systems there. The only one that is available in the U.S. is this combination of SABA, ICS, albuterol, budesonide, which is called Air Supra. It had pretty impressive evidence of efficacy in a New England Journal article that came out a couple of years ago, and it's also pretty expensive. These are some of we basically talked about. These are some of the updates from in 2025 applied to the different tracks. They do make a point to emphasize non-pharmacologic strategies, quitting smoking, reducing weight, vaccinations, doing pulmonary rehab, also really important and relevant to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from inhalers, because if you're using less, there's less that's going into the atmosphere. This is evidence for some of the different approaches. So the anti-inflammatory reliever only with Symbicort versus albuterol alone on the left, and then for maintenance and reliever therapy, MART with budesonide versus other medications. And in general, the combo inhaler, ICS formoterol, used as needed is more effective, and used as a maintenance and reliever is much more effective. Problem is, here in the US, the only version of a maintenance and reliever inhaler, Symbicort or Dulera, is available as MDI. Even though outside of the US, just to the north in Canada, over in Europe, a lot of other countries, there's a DPI version called Symbicort Turbohaler that is just as effective and has a way lower carbon footprint, but it has not been released in the United States for reasons that are unclear, but I think getting more clear. As a result of that, and probably several other things, the Symbicort intermediate dose inhaler is only approved for maintenance treatment. It's not approved for anti-inflammatory relief. I don't know why this is. I don't know what the story is there. But I know the consequence, which is a lot of insurance companies will then say, oh, you can't use Symbicort. We're not going to pay for it. If you're just using it for anti-inflammatory relief, you have to use the albuterol, which is not as good and leads to more problems. I mentioned that Air Supra has been approved as the only version of a anti-inflammatory rescue, but it's around $500 or more per inhaler without insurance. I'm sure it's a little bit less, but not much if you have insurance. And I don't think we can get it in the VA. That's Leon, but he would probably tell me no. Okay, so those are the guidelines for COPD and asthma. Let's talk a little bit about how these inhalers might be making asthma and COPD worse. So this is a screenshot of the different greenhouse gas waste and measured greenhouse gas in the U.S. healthcare system, and it's called the different scopes in the greenhouse gas protocol. Each scope is a colored circle, and the size maps to the relative impact. So scope 1 are direct emissions from a hospital. That's anesthetic gases that leak out of the hospital. That's gases that come out of the cars that the hospital owns or directly from the facilities, their power plants. That's about 10% of the total footprint, 10 to 15. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, easily measured, estimated based off of your electricity and energy uses, because you map that back to some carbon source depending on where you are. That's around 10% of the footprint. The green one is things that are outside the scope but still pretty relevant, and that's patient and visitor travel, which when you think about telehealth is a pretty important area to consider. But the biggest scope is scope 3, which is 80% of the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from a healthcare system. And in there, highlighted is meter dose inhalers because of their outside impact. When some estimates put pharmaceuticals in the US at about 11% of the greenhouse gas emissions for healthcare systems, but we still don't know. Actually, I guess we have a better idea of the amount of meter dose inhalers that's contributing to that. This is something where, as healthcare systems try to reduce their carbon footprint, and those that are still adhering to a goal that has moved from a federal source now to a private supporter, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by the year 2030. to net zero by 2050. There's a lot of things that they can do, and the Agency for Health Research and Quality published this a couple of years ago, where they related to pharmaceuticals and chemicals. They specifically call out meter dose inhalers as something to measure and mitigate, and to try to find lower carbon alternatives for those inhalers. I'll also point out, as my colleague Jyoti Malasetti reminded me, that this information was taken down earlier this year, so it's only available in archival states, but it is still there. In terms of how much measurement of greenhouse gas emissions is occurring in the US, it's not that great, not as good as European countries, and definitely not as good as England. This study last year by John Balbus and colleagues looked at the hospitals in the United States and how many of them were measuring the greenhouse gas emissions, since they're a pretty large part of the US healthcare system. And of over 6,000 hospitals back in 2022, only about a third of them were measuring any component of greenhouse gases. And most of it was around energy utilization, because most hospitals measure that, and many hospitals measure that and waste. They were doing so in a way that was accessible or repeatable. All right, so thankfully, over the past few months, there's been research that has helped to get a little bit more information about what impact inhalers are having. I was happy to be able to contribute to this. This first article by Jyoti Malasetti and colleagues, she's at Stanford, colleagues from there and elsewhere, looked at the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and costs from inhaler devices in the US for 1 year among using CMS data. So that's Medicare and Medicaid folks. And they estimated that it accounted for about 1.15 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents during that time. The vast majority of it, as you might expect, come from those meter dose inhalers that we were just talking about as being important for asthma and COPD care. This amount of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions was equivalent to that which over 200,000 houses would generate with their electricity use over a year. So a substantial amount. Just 2 weeks ago, Bill Feldman, Brian Cheeseborough, and colleagues published this article in JAMA, and they looked more broadly at the US commercial market using PBM data. So that's this aggregated pharmacy benefits management data that Bill Feldman has access to. And they went back and looked for a decade look back at patients that include Medicare and Medicaid folks, as well as commercial insurance. And during that decade, there were 1.6 billion inhalers or more that were dispensed that generated about 25 million metric tons total greenhouse gas carbon dioxide equivalents. And 98% of that came from those meter dose inhalers. They specifically called out the SABAs, which were albuterol, I6 LABAs, mainly Symbicort, a few other ones, and then inhaled corticosteroids, which were a myriad ones. We'll look at that. During that time period of that decade, the inhaler-related absolute emissions grew by about 24%, up to 2.3 million per year, mainly due to greater prescribing, more inhalers, more people. If you actually look at the intensity per inhaler, it decreased a little bit. They were using more soft mist inhaler, more dry powder inhaler that have a little bit better carbon footprint. But they estimated this was equivalent to around 500,000 US homes, or more than 500,000 gas-powered cars driven each year. This is the chart of the inhaler-related emissions. So you can see how much albuterol was generating up top. And then the next one is budesonide for Motorol. I think we read that. Symbicort, followed by inhaled corticosteroids and other inhaled corticosteroid-containing inhalers. So our paper came out in that same issue with Bill Feldman's paper. One of his co-authors, one of my co-authors, Brian Cheeseborough, and Jeremy Boyd, who works here at the Boise VA in the research department, was participating in that. Garrett Smith was integral too. He's doing something with the kids today, so he's not able to attend, but much appreciation to Garrett for his work as well. We were able to look at the area that Bill Feldman and his group wasn't able to look at, and that's this carve out of the VA, because we have our own internal data. We also had a bit of I would argue, a richer data source and Brian Cheesebro thought it was a pretty amazing one because being an integrated healthcare system, we had inpatient and outpatient longitudinally with great great potential to link it to patient records to understand what the drivers were. In our evaluation, we went a little bit farther back to 2008, and we saw that the annual CO2 equivalence work was around 300,000 metric tons way back in 2008, and it had decreased to less than 100,000 in our most recent year of 2023. Similar to the other studies, metered-dose inhalers, and specifically albuterol, Symbicort, ICS, inhaled corticosteroid containing medications, were greater than 95% of total emissions. And 97% of it was outpatient, which I think is important when you think about where you want to address reductions. It's going to be in the outpatient area that you'll get the main bang for your buck. The percentages of the different components is about 2/3 albuterol was contributing to the carbon footprint. About 20% inhaled corticosteroid, long-acting beta agonist, and about 10% inhaled corticosteroid. And this, some of you have seen before because I presented the preliminary data. This is the final published version that shows how over time we've decreased quite a bit. And this is because of international regulation that phased out fluorofluorocarbons, which were one of the early propellants in inhalers. During this time, the evidence regarding the efficacy and of inhaled corticosteroids, we talked about related to COPD and asthma, was becoming more and more common. So that footprint from metered-dose inhalers was growing until 2021, at which time the VA, for cost reasons and clinical equivalence, clinical equivalence reasons, changed from Symbicort to Exela, which is a dry powder inhaler, and that dropped off. This wedge of inhaled corticosteroid on its own has been small but increasing, and there's still a significant amount of albuterol over time. You could be a pessimist and say, wow, that's a lot of albuterol, or you could be an optimist and appreciate the hard work that pharmacists do at the VA to say, no, you don't need 20 inhalers in a year. You should actually probably use less and get better control some other way. But they've been able to kind of tamp that down. And when you look at this over time, realizing that there's been a pretty significant growth in the veteran population from around, maybe less than 8 million at the beginning of the study to around 9 million at the end of the study. The per veteran inhaler intensity has decreased by 74%. So the VA has done a good job in decreasing its carbon footprint in this area without even trying. I took out the impacts from the Montreal Protocol because it's not likely we're going to see effective international regulation around this too soon. We'll talk about that more. But even just with formulary changes, there was a 43% decrease over that time. Okay, all right, we'll wrap up talking about the path forward. So trying to put all this stuff into context. I'll talk about it, trust me. Yeah. So you're going to ask, but wait, what about the study by Alex Rabin and colleagues? Okay, sorry, what did we say? Phil, sorry. Yeah.
We could contextualize metric tons
Oh.
in relation to other greenhouse pollutants. In part because when I think about like what can these individual providers do, as far as I know, the data suggests the biggest bang for the buck is to eat less meat.
Yeah.
In terms of the impact I personally can have on climate change. And so I guess I'm kind of curious, can you contextualize?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that it's probably the pharmaceutical companies that need to work on creating less, not be prescribing less medications. For
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm
curious about that.
Great question. I have a slide on it a little bit later, but the general idea is that if you switch one patient off of a high carbon footprint, high greenhouse gas inhaler regimen, get them on a DPI, get them well controlled with their asthma, you can affect it's about 250 to 450 kilograms per year of CO2 equivalents for one patient. That's equivalent to switching from a gas powered car to a hybrid. That's equivalent to for one person from going from a primarily meat-based diet to a plant-based diet. So it's on par with those types of actions for one patient. You can make with a medication choice that maybe is cost neutral, sometimes better, and has as good or better outcomes a lot of the time. There's a lot more to talk about there. There's kind of like the climate folks that say, well, wait a second, if you drink a glass of orange juice a day, or eat a hamburger a day, it's this much, and it's on par with that. So I think what I come back to is there are lots of competing demands and a lot of things that say, yeah, this is just a drop in the bucket. I try to flip this conversation on its head and say, this is, this is the tip of the spear to address pharmaceutical impacts. That is, right after anesthetic gases, one of the most important things that we could do is internal medicine types to have a quick and a long-lasting impact on climate change. Because again, these hydrofluoroalkanes, they have an effect of 20 to 30 years, but it's like methane. It's really strong for 20, 30 years and they fade away. Getting rid of them sooner will have better long-term benefits. All right, so how do we do that? Well, there's some low-hanging fruit that you can just think about. The VA already does this to a significant degree, but we could do better. And all of the metered-dose inhalers for albuterol are not the same. So the brand or generic version of Ventolin, which is commonly used, it has a larger volume of propellant, which has more greenhouse gas impact. At the bottom right, you see that it's about 30 kilograms of CO2 emissions for its 200 puffs, because it's a bigger inhaler, it just has more in it. If you switch to Preventol, which is just as effective, it's the same active ingredient, but in a smaller delivery device with less propellant, you cut that down to a third automatically. So being aware of that can be a really useful way to change your practice. That's a discussion to have with patients, depending on what they can get, and discussion to have with your pharmacist and healthcare system. If the VA, we estimated that VA did this, it would further reduce their emissions by about 17.6%. You could consider the DPI version, the ProAir Respiratory of albuterol. It's still super expensive. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So, but that option may become more feasible in the future. Another important thing to do is maximize guideline concordant care. So if people are not well controlled and they're huffing their albuterol all the time, that's just putting more of that same HFA into the atmosphere, and it's not necessarily good for them. So when you think about COPD patients, reassessing how they're doing and considering changing them to a LAMA or a LABA, which come in soft mist inhaler form. So tiotropium, Respimat, Stiolto combo soft mist inhaler. Also, you can always think about deprescribing. I think as clinicians, we give medications out. We rarely take them away. We have to really think about it. Pharmacists love it when we take stuff away, right, Tom? We love it when we get rid of antibiotics early and appropriately, but appropriately.
Makes me sleep well on night.
Okay, good. Yeah. So think about our pharmacy colleagues when you're trying to get somebody off of a medication. Inhaled corticosteroids are something you can deprescribe. You can't just turn it off. It's better to taper so you don't precipitate a flare, but we should be doing that to prevent pneumonias and other adverse outcomes, as well as being cost effective and environmentally conscious. For asthma, doing what you can do to improve their care to be concordant with GINA guidelines and decrease the amount of extra albuterol they're using can be an effective tactic. One study suggested that there's a 20% improvement in control, better symptoms, and a decrease of about 50 kilograms of carbon dioxide per patient per year, just by doing that. And then as these triple inhalers become more available, less costly, consider using them, particularly the DPI versions. There is evidence that these have better efficacy, the DPI triple inhalers, than the metered dose inhalers with observational trial, which we talk about. We're pretty interested. All right, finally, formulary level changes can be done where you say, hey, wait a second, we have a DPI version of a similar medication that's in NDA. Let's switch it up. And this happens. The VA did that as represented in our data set. You could consider that in asthma, but there's not any alternative options that contain formoterol in the US, so that's pretty limiting. If you have a patient that is not approved for Symbicort, the one that they should be on. The insurance company says, oh, there's something, you have to use these other ones. You could consider a DPI or softness inhaler there, but we really should still be using the Symbicort formoterol option for patients with asthma. In COPD, we're going to pivot back to the VA data a little bit to review this study by Alex Rabin and colleagues. He's at the Ann Arbor VA. And he's a pulmonologist and health sciences researchers that looked at that change where they went from Symbicort to Wixela. And he said, how did people do? His hypothesis was that they would do the same. Unfortunately, they did not. The bottom line up front is that transition from budesonide formoterol metered-dose inhaler to fluticasone 7-meter dry powder inhaler was associated with more ER visits and hospitalizations. They did a pretty good approach to it. It was an observational study, but they used the same people as their own controls, and then they did cohorts between two groups to compare them. They analyzed the outcomes which we think would be relevant, which was use of rescue medications as well as healthcare utilization. They looked at mortality, but there wasn't any mortality different. It wasn't necessarily powered to detect that. It was powered to detect these findings, which illustrate that for some reason that I can't explain still, folks that switched to Wixela dry powder inhaler used less albuterol. Don't know why. They used a little more prednisone, but more importantly, they had more hospitalizations and ER visits, and specifically for pneumonia. This was, reasonably statistically significant for an observational trial, but this 24 to 25% increase in ER visits and hospitalizations and pneumonias, I think is a concerning signal related to this transition. So you'll ask, why did that happen, right? Was it the fact that it was a meter dose in a dry powder, they weren't able to inhale as well? There's something about the mechanism. This seems unlikely. And 3 studies that I'd cite for the past 2 years suggest that very specifically in the first study, when you took salmeterol, fluticasone inhalers that were brand name Advair and went from a meter dose to dry powder inhaler, there was no change. In another study done by Bill Feldman, I mentioned earlier, where they had triple inhalers that went from meter dose to dry powder, the meter dose inhalers actually did worse. There was more hospitalizations for COPD and no difference in pneumonia in that sense. And finally, there was a study done in Denmark looking at transitions from meter dose inhalers to dry powder inhalers and softness inhalers, and they found that there was no difference in hospitalization, death, or pneumonia. So I don't think it's the delivery device, and I would pontificate on why. I assume some of it's related to the components. Wixela has fluticasone propionate, which is associated in other studies with a higher risk of pneumonia than budesonide. So I think that was probably a partial driver. I also think there's, with any observational study, you can have confounding, which is unadjusted. And Alex and his crew did not adjust for whether or not the patient was seeing a pulmonologist. And I think there would have been bias for folks that actually were not transitioned to Wixela, being more likely to have a pulmonologist and having better care. So thus avoiding hospitalizations, theoretically. Also, salmeterol is not appropriate for folks with asthma. So if any folks have asthma, that component would drive it. The thing that I think was most important is that the way the formula change was rolled out, when we do this, it's unfortunate, but we mail out a new medication, say, hey, here's a letter, BT does, you change the medication. It's confusing. It doesn't work the same way. Use it and you'll be fine. I think we need a little bit more pharmacy education around that. That probably led to some people not using it correctly, not understanding what was going on, maybe doubling up with the other one and increasing their inhaled corticosteroid risk and putting them at risk for pneumonia. This has all happened to be done during something called the COVID pandemic. So it was a difficult time for folks to get into healthcare because everybody was busy treating COVID. All right. So that's a little bit of a pause when you think about making some of these larger changes. But I'm going to pivot to the north and look at Canada's guidance, their wisdom. 2 articles that I liked. One was from General Turner saying, hey, this is something that we should be doing. These are of the 8 things that we recommend to decrease sustainability or increase sustainability of healthcare systems. Meter dose inhaler should be part of it. The Canadian Thoracic Society also called out the importance of this, but emphasized that it be done with shared decision-making with patients. The GINA guidelines are mentioning the importance of this as a consideration, where it's, they suggest that if one inhaler is suitable for a patient, then choose the one that has a lower environmental impact. And they have a shared decision-making schema where you make sure that medication is available to the patient. You make sure the patient uses it correctly, and then you make sure it's the most environmentally friendly one. A study of Canadian patients suggested that when you talk to them, it's actually useful. So I would encourage you talking to your patients, particularly around this subject. This survey suggests that that only 21% were aware that certain inhalers were worse than other ones. And then when they were aware of that and had that discussion with their provider, more than half thought it was important or very important to choose a low carbon inhaler. And I've had these discussions with my patients. I feel like I have a similar experience where they're not aware of this, but when you start to talk to them about it, they're like, oh yeah, why wouldn't I do that? That just makes sense. To help us do this is difficult. This is one resource that I think is super useful. The Cascades organization is a Canadian group that makes recommendations to healthcare providers and systems to decrease their carbon footprint. This is a great resource if you want to get some information around sustainability efforts. The only problem is it's very Canada specific. So the same medications that they have on their charts aren't the ones that we have here, particularly around things like Symbicort, dry powder inhaler. But there's hope because our own Matt Bird, one of the chief residents of quality and safety here at the VA, is working with Dr. Tuma Malasetti in Stanford to adapt some of this information to a US formulary and make recommendations. So Matt was kind enough to share some screenshots from the website that he's working on here. And we're hoping that that can be a resource for folks. There's a lot of things that we can do to reduce waste, to use our electronic health record, to prompt us to think about this, to leverage registries of medications and patients, and to start to measure this type of stuff. I realize we're running short on time, but make the quick point that there are industry considerations. The industry is aware of the fact that these are harmful pellets, so they're coming up with new ones that are fancier and way more expensive. And just like they did in 2013 when we got rid of CFC propellants, they're going to rebrand the same medications, have patent exclusivity for 7 to 10 years, depending on how long the lawyers can make it happen, and they'll rake in a lot of money around it. So even though it should be getting better, that will slow it down because of the tension between the costs that they want to put on. If you want to tell AstraZeneca to release the dry powder Symbicort inhaler here in the US, you can sign a letter that Healthcare Without Harm out of Boston is trying to use to leverage them. And I'll skip the regulation EPA benefits other than to say, if we are given the chance to continue to regulate greenhouse gases as we have for the past 35 years, along with air pollution for the last 35 years, there's a lot of benefits that result in terms of lives saved, comorbidity avoided, and honestly, costs saved. Yeah, even though there's a cost to regulation, there's a cost to the morbidity and mortality that results from that, and it's a drop in the bucket comparatively. This is the slide that Andrew Christopher had asked about earlier, where it compares making a change for an inhaler with cost savings comparisons comparable to going to a plant-based diet, driving a hybrid car, et cetera. And we'll wrap up with lessons learned. We all learned a bunch, great. And acknowledgements to collaborators. And thanks. If you want to do questions, come on up. Otherwise, get to your next thing. I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, guys. There's no potential sign. How can sign